So this is one of my favorite parts of this particular topic, and that is to talk about the incredibly bizarre and weird history of the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. And so my hope is that uh, leading up to this discussion, you took the time to look at what the 27th Amendment to the Constitution actually was or is. And the um, 27th Amendment to the Constitution stipulates that if Congress wants to give itself a pay raise, it has to first withstand an election by the people before a pay raise will go into effect. So essentially, Congress has to propose a raise in its pay, and then when it's up for election, when all 435 members of the House and 35 members of the Senate stand for an election, they have to defend to their constituents why they deserve such a pay raise. Um, and this particular amendment was actually one of the 12 amendments that Madison wrote that ended up being proposed to the states for ratification. And remember, in that series 1 through 12, amendments 3 through 12 are what became the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So there's two amendments that nobody ever talks about. So let me say a little bit about those two. The first in the series of 12 amendments had to do with setting the size of congressional districts. And so the Madison wanted to make sure that elected officials had a close connection with their constituency. And so the amendment would forbid a congressional district from getting too big. So it would set the population size of each congressional district. And in that instance, that amendment went nowhere. It got very little support because most understood, and the worry was, in fact, that the population of this country would eventually grow, and they didn't want to have a House of Representatives, in particular, that had hundreds and hundreds of legislators who made it up because they were set with the size of the congressional districts. They understood that if it got too big, the House of Representatives would not be a functioning body of Congress. And so that amendment didn't go anywhere. This second in that series was this 27th Amendment. So it said that if Congress wants to give itself a pay raise, it has to defend that pay raise in an election. And so it got initial support when it was first proposed back in the 1790s. And it never really got the three-fourths necessary, or came close enough to the three-fourths necessary to be a part of the Constitution. Now, this amendment, it didn't have a killer clause in it. So it didn't specify that if it hadn't been ratified by X number of years, it automatically died. And so it got shuffled and lost to history. It made a couple of appearances over time, particularly as the public got fed up with the disconnectedness of the Congress, and so it would be rediscovered. There would be then an effort to try to get the necessary additional states to ratify, but again, falling short each and every time. Which brings us up to the modern period. So, what happened that eventually got the 27th Amendment passed? So, in the late 1980s, Congress was racked by a series of scandals. And the scandals involved members of Congress who operated under a different set of laws than the public at large. So members of Congress, for example, they would rack up a bunch of parking violations or traffic violations, but wouldn't have to pay them because members of Congress are immune from misdemeanors. And in addition, there was a check cashing scandal in which members of Congress were bouncing checks with the House Bank and weren't incurring fines as a result of bouncing a check. And if you've ever bounced a check, you know that the fines tend to be fairly severe. And so members of Congress were bouncing lots and lots of checks and weren't fined as a result of doing so. And so the Congress's public approval numbers really plummeted, so that by the time we got to 1990, 1992 in particular, when this was passed, Congress hit at that time an all-time low of 18% public approval. Believe it or not, it would actually fall into the single digits in 2013 and has fallen again in the single digits most recently. And so what brought this to the fore was at the very end of a congressional session in 1990, Congress had brought up a pay raise. Now, Congress had routinely granted itself a pay raise without the public paying much mind at all. So this was not an issue that had really ever come up before. But the public was really riled up now. And you have to take into account also that one of the new mediums on the scene at this time was political talk radio. Political talk radio sprung to life in the United States as a result of a change in the FCC rules, allowing for radio and television to engage in partisan debates without having to cover it from a lot of different sides. And so in this instance, political talk radio took this issue that Congress is trying to give itself a pay raise and it's doing an absolute lousy job. You need to call your member of Congress up and tell them you better not vote for this pay raise. And sure enough, hundreds and hundreds of people called their members of Congress saying, you better not vote for this pay raise. And then Congress, on a vote on the pay raise, voted it down. The people win, right? However, right at the very last day of the legislative session, Congress added a pay raise as an amendment to a defense spending bill, knowing that the president would have to either accept the entire bill or veto the entire bill. And they did this in the dead of night. So it was the very last thing they worked on and held the vote close to midnight on that particular day, hoping that this, bearing it in this massive defense spending bill and holding the vote late at night wouldn't attract attention. Well, it did attract attention. The public exploded in outrage. Political talk radio had a field day with this. And the public said there must be something that we can do to force Congress to listen to the American public when it says you don't deserve a pay raise. Well, in steps this character here, Greg Watson. Now, Greg Watson, in the early 1980s, had been a student at the University of Texas, and he was an economics student and a political science double major. And he had, in a constitutional law class, written a paper. So the constitutional law professor in his undergrad paper asked that they pick an interesting constitutional issue and write about it. And so Greg Watson discovered that there was this amendment that had gotten a lot of support all over American history, but never got to the 3/4 necessary to be ratified. And that this thing was still a viable amendment and could still be added to the Constitution. And his con law professor, in grading the paper, gave him a C+ and said that was the stupidest argument that he had ever heard. And so Greg Watson took his sorry little C+ paper and filed it away. He eventually went on to law school, but he never lost interest in this issue. Well, fast forward to 1990, 1991, public outroar. We need to do something about congressional pay raises. And in steps Greg Watson with his C+ paper and says, we can do something. I found out when I wrote this thing that this was still a viable amendment and it could still be ratified as part of the Constitution. And so a number of states began asking the National Archivist, who's the one who certifies that the constitutional amendments are legitimate, that they've met the qualifications of proposal and ratification. So the National Archivist said, yeah, there's no killer proposal to this thing. It's still a viable amendment. And as a result, a number of states then quickly ratified the amendment, making it the 27th Amendment to the Constitution 203 years after it was first introduced. So technically, and this may be a fun way to trip up your parents and your relatives come Thanksgiving, and ask them how many amendments make up the Bill of Rights, and they'll say 10, and you can say, well, Madison wrote 12 amendments. So of the 12, how many of those amendments should be considered part of the Bill of Rights? And you can say technically 11, given that one of those proposed amendments that would make up the Bill of Rights didn't get added right away, but had to wait its turn 200+ years after the fact. So that is topic 2 that we'll bring to an end. Tomorrow we're going to begin talking about federalism and topic 3. So we'll pick up with that lecture next.